Hirsch-Lauderpacht, 1897 to 1960, was one of the most influential legal scholars of the 20th century, particularly in the field of international law. His work, An International Bill of the Rights of Man, published in 1945, was a groundbreaking contribution to the development of human rights as a universal legal and moral principle. In this book, Lauderpacht argued for the codification of fundamental human rights in international law, proposing a framework that would later influence the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, in 1948. This essay explores the key themes of an international bill of the rights of man, including Lauderpacht's legal philosophy, his arguments for the necessity of international human rights law, the book's historical context, and its impact on later developments in human rights. By analyzing Lauderpacht's vision, we can better understand the foundations of modern human rights law and its ongoing relevance today. Hirsch-Lauderpacht's legal philosophy. Lauderpacht was deeply influenced by natural law theory, which holds that certain rights are inherent to human beings by virtue of their existence rather than granted by the state. However, he also engaged with the positivist tradition, recognizing the necessity of codifying rights in legally binding documents. His legal philosophy combined moral idealism with a pragmatic approach, advocating that international law must be based on fundamental human dignity and justice. A key principle in Lauderpacht's thought was the idea that international law should prioritize the individual rather than the state. He challenged the traditional Westphalian model of sovereignty, which placed states at the center of legal order and often treated individuals as subjects of domestic rather than international law. Lauderpacht believed that without legally enforceable human rights protections at the international level, individuals remained vulnerable to state abuses. Historical context of the book. Lauderpacht wrote An International Bill of the Rights of Man during World War II, a time of unprecedented human rights violations. The Holocaust, mass atrocities, and war crimes committed by Nazi Germany and its allies exposed the inadequacies of existing international legal frameworks. The League of Nations had failed to prevent these horrors, and many legal scholars and policymakers recognized the urgent need for a new global human rights regime. Lauderpacht's book was published in 1945, the same year the United Nations, UN, was founded. His work directly influenced the drafting of the UN Charter and later the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As one of the leading voices in international law, he contributed significantly to the intellectual foundations of the post-war human rights movement. Key arguments in An International Bill of the Rights of Man. 1. The need for a universal Bill of Rights. One of Lauderpacht's core arguments was that human rights must be recognized and protected universally, beyond the jurisdiction of individual states. He proposed an international Bill of Rights that would set out fundamental freedoms and protections for all individuals, regardless of nationality. This idea was revolutionary at a time when international law largely focused on relations between states rather than the rights of individuals. Lauderpacht was critical of the argument that human rights should be left to national governments. He pointed out that many states had historically failed to protect their citizens' rights, and some had actively engaged in oppression and genocide. A universal Bill of Rights, he argued, would serve as a safeguard against state abuses and ensure a minimum standard of justice for all people. The role of international law in protecting human rights. Lauderpacht believed that international law had to evolve beyond traditional diplomatic agreements and treaties to include enforceable human rights protections. He proposed that human rights should be integrated into international law in a way that would allow individuals to seek legal remedies at the global level. His vision anticipated later developments, such as the establishment of international human rights courts and mechanisms for holding states accountable for human rights violations. The European Court of Human Rights, established in 1959, and the International Criminal Court, established in 2002, reflect Lauderpacht's belief that legal institutions should play a central role in upholding human rights. 3. The relationship between human rights and state sovereignty. A major challenge in promoting international human rights law is the tension between state sovereignty and external intervention. Lauterpacht addressed this issue by arguing that sovereignty should not be an absolute shield for states to commit abuses. Instead, he viewed sovereignty as carrying responsibilities, including the duty to respect and protect human rights. He advocated for a balanced approach in which states retained autonomy but were also subject to international scrutiny and legal obligations. His ideas influenced the later concept of the responsibility to protect, R2P, which holds that states must prevent genocide, war crimes, and other mass atrocities, or face intervention from the international community. Number 4. The specific rights to be included in a Bill of Rights. Lauterpacht's proposed Bill of Rights covered a broad range of civil, political, economic, and social rights. These included the right to life, liberty, and security of person, freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, protection from arbitrary arrest and torture, the right to a fair trial, the right to work, education, and social security. His comprehensive approach reflected his belief that human rights were interconnected and that political freedoms could not be fully realized without economic and social protections. Impact of an International Bill of the Rights of Man. Lauterpacht's work had a profound influence on the development of international human rights law. His ideas helped shape the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. Many of the rights he outlined in an International Bill of the Rights of Man were incorporated into the UDHR and later became legally binding through treaties such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, ICSCR. His arguments also influenced the establishment of human rights enforcement mechanisms, including the European Convention on Human Rights, 1950, and the UN's human rights monitoring bodies. The principle that individuals have rights under international law, which Lauterpacht championed, is now widely accepted and forms the basis of modern human rights jurisprudence. Criticism and limitation. Despite its significance, an International Bill of the Rights of Man has faced criticism. Some legal scholars argue that Lauterpacht's emphasis on legal mechanisms and state obligations overlooked deeper structural issues, such as economic inequalities and power imbalances in international relations. Others have noted that his approach, while ambitious, was difficult to implement in a world where many states resisted external human rights scrutiny. Additionally, some critics have pointed out that Lauterpacht's work focused primarily on Western legal traditions and did not sufficiently engage with non-Western perspectives on human rights. The post-war human rights movement has since expanded to include more diverse viewpoints, incorporating cultural and regional differences in the interpretation and application of human rights. Hirsch Lauterpacht's An International Bill of the Rights of Man was a landmark work that laid the intellectual foundation for modern human rights law. His vision of a universal, legally enforceable human rights framework has shaped international legal institutions, treaties, and advocacy efforts for decades. While some of his proposals faced resistance and challenges in implementation, his core argument that human rights must be protected at the international level to prevent state abuses remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. As the world continues to grapple with human rights crises, Lauterpacht's work serves as a reminder of the importance of legal protections for individuals and the ongoing struggle to ensure justice and dignity for all.